Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a seriously fascinating journey through the entire history of Australia. We're going to track how a remote landmass at the edge of the known world, one that was initially settled by Europeans as a pretty brutal penal colony, transformed into the massive global economic and cultural powerhouse it is today. It's an absolutely incredible story of transformation, resilience, and evolution. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. We're looking at a staggering paradox here. Back in 1870, Australia was largely governed as a harsh penal colony, and the average life expectancy for a newborn? Just 34 years. It was a life of grueling, arduous labor in a totally unforgiving environment. Fast forward to modern Australia, and we see average life expectancies soaring to over 81 years for men and 85 years for women. That is a massive, massive leap.
Today, that grim reality has completely flipped. Australia now boasts top-tier global livability, enviably high education, and fantastic wages. In fact, it's such a coveted destination for its stability and laid-back lifestyle that 5 of its major cities, we're talking Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, and Adelaide, regularly land right in the top 10 of the Global Livability Index.
So, this brings us to the Australian paradox. How exactly did a harsh place for punishment become a place where literally everyone wants to live?
Well, to answer that, we have to look at First Nations and European arrival. We're talking 65,000 years of history colliding with the Great Age of Discovery.
Just think about the sheer scale of this number for a second. 65,000. That represents the incredible number of years of continuous Aboriginal habitation. Humans first migrated to this massive Australian continent from Southeast Asia at the very end of the last ice age. Seriously, let that timeline sink in.
Over those subsequent millennia, they formed the Aboriginal First Nations. This wasn't just a monolith either. We're talking about over 500 distinct tribal groups, each with unique languages and territories, stretching all the way from the Torres Strait Islands up north, right down to Tasmania in the south. These diverse societies lived relatively undisturbed for countless generations, deeply, deeply connected to the land. Now let's move to and see how this builds, because this ancient status quo shifted dramatically in the 17th century. The European Age of Discovery brought explorers who were hunting for this mythical landmass they called Terra Australis. In 1606, a Dutch vessel commanded by Willem Johnson made the first documented landfall. Then, a century and a half later, in 1770, Britain's Captain James Cook charted the East Coast, specifically Botany Bay. And finally, in 1788, the first fleet arrived at Sydney Cove to establish a permanent presence.
But why did the British actually decide to settle there? It really comes down to a fascinating geopolitical plot twist. Following the American Revolution, Britain lost its American colonies, meaning they couldn't just send their petty criminals across the Atlantic anymore. So, America's independence directly caused the British government to pivot and dump their convicts on the complete opposite side of the world in Sydney Cove instead. It's a crazy butterfly effect.
Which leads us to our next era, from prison to prosperity. We'll be covering disease, the frontier wars, and the 1851 gold rush.
The initial British arrival brought with it a devastating smallpox outbreak in 1789 that absolutely decimated the local population, who, of course, possessed no natural immunity. But beyond disease, relations were severely strained by fundamental cultural misunderstandings. To the Aboriginal peoples, any animal on the land, whether native or introduced, was fair game to be hunted. But to the British settlers, hunting their introduced sheep or cattle was seen as the illegal poaching of private livestock. Tragically, these fundamental clashes over resources, paired with unrelenting European expansion onto Aboriginal lands, ignited what became known as the Frontier Wars. Spanning from the late 18th all the way into the early 20th centuries, this was a spiraling cycle of violence. As colonial settlements pushed further and further into the interior of the continent, it led to violent confrontations, reprisals, and indiscriminate massacres on both sides. But then, the trajectory of this struggling colony shifted literally overnight. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is this massive population explosion. Back in 1851, the total population was around 430,000. But the discovery of gold that very same year triggered a monumental gold rush. By 1861, just 10 years later, guys, the population had exploded to nearly 1.2 million, as hopeful prospectors from all over the world flooded into the gold fields.
all that sudden wealth and massive influx of diverse people directly challenged the heavy-handed autocratic colonial rule. In 1854, rebel miners fought the Battle of the Eureka Stockade against harsh local taxes. And while the miners were technically defeated, massive public support for their cause actually sparked early democratic reform. It cemented a fiercely protective sense of Australian egalitarianism, that laid-back, fair-go attitude the country is still famous for today. This era also birthed the romanticized folklore of bushrangers, outlaws like Ned Kelly, who used the wealth of the goldfields to become enshrined in national legend.
Now we're moving into forging a national identity, federation, world wars, and finally moving out of Britain's shadow.
Following a really severe economic depression in the 1890s, a growing sense of national sentiment pushed for true unity. On January 1, 1901, the modern political entity we know today was officially born. The Commonwealth of Australia was formally proclaimed, uniting 6 separate, independent colonies into one single federal nation.
One of the defining pieces of early legislation passed by this new parliament was the White Australia policy in 1901. This was an exclusionary, apartheid-like system explicitly designed to bar non-European immigration, particularly aiming to stop Asian migration. It was essentially implemented as a way for contemporaries to coalesce the new nation by aggressively preserving a predominantly British demographic. But the ultimate test for this fledgling nation arrived with World War I, and the numbers here are truly devastating. Out of a relatively small national population, 324,000 Australians served overseas, 150,000 were wounded, and 60,000 died. That represented the highest casualty rate of any Allied force in the entire war. Their renowned bravery, particularly at Gallipoli and on the Western Front, forged the resilient Anzac legend that remains a huge cornerstone of the national psyche today.
Moving into the 1920s and 30s, between the wars and amidst a crushing global economic depression, Australians managed to find hope in some remarkable cultural and sporting achievements. In 1920, the Qantas airline was established. By 1927, the first aerial circumnavigation of the vast continent was actually completed, and sports legends emerged to really lift the nation's spirits. Figures like the cricket phenomenon Don Bradman and championship racehorse Phar Lap brought some much-needed cheer during those really dark Depression days.
Then came a massive, permanent geopolitical pivot during World War II. First, Japan brought the war directly to Australian shores, launching devastating bombing raids on Darwin and a brazen submarine attack right in Sydney Harbor. Second, Australia had this harsh realization that a war-torn, distant Britain simply could not offer sole protection anymore. And third, this forced a permanent realignment. Australia completely shifted its diplomatic and military strategy away from London, aligning firmly with the United States.
That brings us to our final section, modernity and reconciliation, post-World War II immigration and acknowledging the past. After the war, Australia experienced an absolutely incredible economic boom. To fuel a massive expansion in manufacturing and housing, they desperately needed labor. This sparked a huge influx of war-ravaged European immigrants, which completely transformed the country's demographics and ultimately forced the dismantling of that restrictive White Australia policy. Plus, Australia's relative geographic isolation brilliantly shielded it from the most severe tensions of the Cold War.
As the nation matured economically and demographically, it also began to mature socially. By the late 20th century, a really critical shift occurred. Australia finally began opening up conversations to confront its colonial past, focusing heavily on acknowledging historical injustices and beginning the long, complex process of reconciling with its indigenous Aboriginal peoples. And as Australia reckoned with its history internally, it was also showcasing its vibrant modernity to the outside world. Iconic, globally recognized events like the inaugural opening of the incredible Sydney Opera House in 1973 and hosting the spectacular Sydney Olympic Games in the year 2000, these perfectly symbolized a confident, dynamic Australia stepping proudly onto the global stage.
So, we arrive at the end of our explainer with a profound, provocative question. How does a nation born with so little create so much? And what does it mean for its future? It's incredible to reflect on the sheer resilience of a nation built from a brutal penal colony, evolving through harsh frontiers, gold rushes, devastating wars, and mass migration to become one of the most prosperous and desirable places on Earth. I really hope this structured look through Australia's history sparked your curiosity to learn even more. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey.